This video is brought to you by the 3 Minute Board Game patrons. Keep us independent by supporting us on Patreon. Kia ora koutou, and welcome to the 3 Minute Board Games Top 100 for 2023. 2023 has been a hell of a year for us with a lot of stuff happening away from the channel. In particular, we had to replace our roof, which leveled our life savings, and Steph also decided to run for Parliament this year. So that has taken up an awful lot of her time, and that has of course eaten into the time I can spend on the channel. Throw into the mix that I've got a 2-year-old that I look after, and yeah, it's been a bit of a full-on year. But that's enough about me, let's go on to the list. And there's a few things to keep in mind here. First, this is my list. The video says the top 100 board games of all time, but it really is just my top 100 board games of all time. That's because there's no real way to do a definitive top 100. Any opinion like this is purely opinion. If you've got different games in your top 100, good for you. What we like to do here in the comments is instead of going, that game shouldn't be on the top 100, tell me games that you think I would like based on what you've seen. Give me recommendations. Try positive feedback and suggestions instead of saying I'm a duty head because I don't like your particular favorite game. And finally, 3 Minute Board Games is an independent channel. We don't take money from publishers and we do not do any form of paid content. If you want to keep independent channels like us alive, consider supporting us on Patreon. Every little bit helps. And without any further delay, onto the video. Mosaic, A Story of Civilization has the ambitious goal of being a civilization game that can be played in 2 to 3 hours. And it very much succeeds at this goal, using a very streamlined action selection system. Mosaic is an exceedingly fast-paced civilization game. XCOM the board game is based on the video game franchise of the same name, and is all about humanity defending against an alien invasion. XCOM is a real-time game supported by an app where you have to make fast decisions, and it's a great example of a board game experience that couldn't be realized without an app. If you want a game that makes you feel like you're in a genuine pressure situation, XCOM the board game could be for you. Freedom the Underground Railroad is a cooperative game, and it's about freeing slaves from southern plantations in the later days of slavery in the USA, which is a very challenging and confrontational theme. That said, it's also an incredibly tight game, where you have exceedingly limited actions, and you have to make every single one of them count. Exceptionally good solo. Galilean Moons is one of my favorite area control games. It has exceedingly simple core mechanics that make for a fantastic decision space, but it also has emergent powers, which means that every time you play, you're going to use different strategies. I think this is an absolutely great game that a lot of people have slept on. Planet Unknown is my new favorite game about terraforming planets. It's a tile drafting and tile placement game where your tiles represent your terraforming efforts. Made all the more fun and eye-catching because of the Lazy Susan included in the game. Simple but solid core rules combined with lots of corporations and lots of planets combine to make this a really fun game. Imperial Spells and Steam is a traditional train game dialed up to 11. As its production values are through the roof, it's set in an anime world, and you have spell cars, which is all part of big engine building, which is not normally seen inside a train game. It does look a bit excessive and over the top, but that's all part of the spectacle that is Imperial Spells and Steam. Root is a counterinsurgency war game wearing a fursuit. Just about everything I love in the Coin series is in Root as well, but it has more interesting and unique factions in terms of their gameplay mechanics, plus it's all dressed up with that woodland animals committing terrorist acts theme that I just find absolutely wonderful. I have not played the last couple of expansions. The Reckoners is a cooperative dice-based game where you are trying to take down evil supervillains. What really sets the Reckoners apart for me is its timing rules. Every player's actions are represented by dice, but you can take your actions in any order, which leads to some fascinating discussions around teamwork about exactly how to time these dice actions. It's also a stunning looking game, but that's not why it stays in my favorites. It's all about that dice system and having a truly cooperative experience. From the outside, Village looks like your traditional, boring, dull Euro game about wheat and farming. And it somewhat still is, but the cool thing about this game is that you have a family, and family members get assigned to different parts of the village, and as the game progresses, family members pass away. You actually get kind of attached to these little meeples. And it is actually a legitimately clever game, aside from that detail, but that detail is what keeps me emotionally attached to the game and wanting to go back and play it. Lanterns has become one of my go-to games to end a session or to start a session, especially if we've got 4 people present. It's an easy to teach, yet visually compelling tile placement game that you can play with just about anyone. Games take about 20 minutes and they're really tense and fun. I don't really like the term filler game because I think it's belittling, but this is a really great short duration game and would be excellent for travel and kids as well. For the longest time I thought about designing a Star Trek game that was a big narrative spaceship exploration game, and ISS Vanguard is as close to that dream as any game has ever been. I'm only about a third of the way through it, and I am playing it solo, but damn, it's been a really neat experience. The story has pulled me in, and I find the mechanics really engaging. I love flicking through the ship book and deciding what technologies to research, how to use my crew. I think if you're a big fan of Star Trek or Mass Effect or any of those games where you have a ship and a crew and you're going out exploring, you can definitely try out ISS Vanguard. It is a serious time commitment though. The original Android that spawned the whole Android universe that Netrunner is set in. It's one of the most ambitious board games ever sold as a regular retail product. And that's one of the reasons I still admire it all these years later. The characters are fascinating and interesting, and it really is a character study as a board game, which is a very strange thing to say, because the premise of the game is that you're investigating a crime, but that crime is actually very secondary to your character's own journey of self-discovery. And if that sounds a little bit arty and navel-gazing, yeah, it pretty much is. It's quite an experimental game, and that's why it's neat. Not one I'd recommend going out and buying necessarily, but definitely worth having a look at and maybe playing once. I love space racing games, and Space Corp is the game that is most racy as far as space races go. It has a unique 3-act structure where you start off in one act exploring the inner solar system, then the outer solar system, and in Act 3 you're going interstellar. And each of these acts plays slightly differently, but the whole time it is a race to the finish line. Quick-paced card play in this one, and it doesn't have some of the grinding complexity you get with some other space racy type games. And you can play each act as a standalone game if you want to play something shorter. Dead of Winter is a cooperative game, or at least a semi-cooperative game, maybe a traitor game, where you are a group of survivors in a zombie apocalypse, and it has a few standout features. The first of which is its crossroads system and the amount of narrative in this game. There's a whole bunch of events and they're managed in a very interesting way, as crossroads are usually triggered by specific things happening, as opposed to a normal game where you just flip an event card and something happens. I also think that each player is a leader of a group, so if you lose a character or two, it's not necessarily that big a deal. And finally, it's a game that does not need to be played with a traitor, because the inherent selfish goals in this game create enough internal conflict. So my recommendation is to play this one on a higher difficulty, but with no traitor. Then it's a wonderful cooperative experience with just a bit of edge to it. The term I use instead of gateway game is foundation game, and it's funny that Imhotep is one of my favorite foundation games because it's literally about moving foundation blocks around. Very simple rules, but a visually striking and engaging game. Again, another one that only plays in about 30 minutes, but those are 30 minutes crammed with decisions. And the rules really are as simple as get block, place block, or ship block. I've played quite a few of the Legendary games now, and Alien is still my favorite. It was the first to use the Legendary Encounter system, which is far more cooperatively focused than the original Legendary was. And it also added scanning, where cards come into the game face down and you have to spend time flipping them. And that really is the big difference maker here, between why Encounters is so much more fun for me than Legendary. The tension of those cards slowly advancing towards you and you not knowing what they are. Aliens is still the king of the Legendary Encounter series, and I have played quite a few of the other ones now, and of them, the new Matrix one's actually probably the next best. Anyway, this is a very good cooperative deck building game that really connects with its theme. By any reasonable metric, Defenders of the Last Stand would be a terrible game. It's a cooperative game that's a hodgepodge of mechanics and systems from all over the place, but it is also a giant sandbox. It's like playing a game of Pandemic, but one where you can take a whole bunch of side missions and get completely distracted from the focus of the game. And it's that wackiness and instability of the game that I find fascinating and fun. There is so much to love in Gloomhaven. I love the core card system that drives this game, and how varied and interesting the classes are in this exceptional dungeon crawler. The reason it's fallen down my rankings is there's just too much of it. I never finished this game. I've never come close to finishing this game. I've even played 100 hours of this on the app and still not finished the game. And that's because I keep getting stuck on certain missions and not being able to progress. But up until the point I get stuck, I have a whale of a time with Gloomhaven. Mechanically, Abyss is a bit of a by-the-numbers set collection and drafting game, but what elevates it is its really neat theme and the simple tactile pleasure of exchanging pearls with people. Just one of those games that's been really easy to teach, and every time I've taught it to a new group, they've had a great time with it. So when it first came out, I thought it was okay, and it probably didn't help that I originally played it immediately after playing Lost Ruins of Arnak, a game which it shares a fair bit in common with. Now I've had some space and more plays of the game, it's really grown on me, and it's an excellent combination of worker placement and deck building. And while I don't think it's necessarily the most thematic Dune game ever made, I think it's probably the tightest and best made Dune game. Sentinels of the Multiverse is an amazing superhero cooperative game using pre-constructed decks. And what these pre-constructed decks do is allow the creators to make superheroes of real thematic strength to them. Each character truly feels unique and interacts with the game in a unique way. Something I've been looking for in other superhero games, and they've never delivered quite like Sentinels has. Sentinels could easily be a forever game, the kind of game you just play over and over and over and over again endlessly. There's just so much content, so many different combinations, and the core gameplay loop is so rewarding. The Castles of Mad King Ludwig is a bidding and drafting game where you're trying to build these wacky, sprawling castles. It combines the very best of Eurogaming with a tactile and physical sense of actually building a castle. A really clever and creative game that I enjoy each and every time I play it. Architects of the West Kingdom is a rare and fascinating beast, a worker placement game that actually plays better at higher player counts. Normally worker placement games grind down once you get more than 4 players, but Architects, that's where it starts to come alive. And I think that's a lot to do with its fast-paced worker placement system where workers are cycling in and out of the board constantly. It's a very unusual worker placement game and one I highly recommend checking out. Speaking of unusual worker placement games, here's Above and Below, a game that combines both worker placement and narrative storytelling in it. It's got wonderfully quaint and wholesome art, and it's just a very solid and fun game as well. The worker placement game equivalent of a nice warm cup of cocoa. One really noticeable thing with my taste in games over the last couple of years is that I've started to appreciate games that are quick and to the point more. And that's what Acropolis is. It's a drafting and tile placement game with an extra spatial 3-dimensional element that normally isn't found in these kind of games. It's another game that's really easy to teach to people and plays incredibly quickly and leaves people clamoring for another round. Another game I think will be an absolute hit at many family game nights. Modern Art is a simple and brilliant and beautiful game, and easily the best pure auction game I've ever played, because its core mechanics are based around the idea that art has no intrinsic value aside from the value we place on it. Therefore, all of the art starts off as fundamentally worthless, but it's only what we invest in it as players that determines what's hot and what's not. And gamifying that concept and making it simple and easy to engage with and fun is an absolute masterclass in game design. Another challenging and confronting theme, in this case, the efforts inside Germany to assassinate Hitler. Black Orchestra models some very clever things about how conspiracy is run. People aren't instantly ready to assassinate people. It takes a long time for people to build up the courage, the nerve, and the resolve to do so, especially when counterintelligence services are looking for them. And Black Orchestra captures that feeling really well. You're always worried that you're going to get found out before you can assassinate Hitler. This game frequently comes down to one final roll, and that's the assassination attempt. And whether that sounds like a great idea or a terrible idea to you will make a huge difference on whether you think this is a great game too. When I'm asked the question, hey, what game should I play with my non-gamer friend who's interested in gaming but hasn't done much gaming? I almost always answer Century Golem Edition. And that's because it's simple, fun, engaging, and beautiful. You can teach the rules in a few minutes, and people can start making decisions almost immediately. And the beautiful art and the big shiny candy gemstones do capture people's attention. Oathsworn is a big, ambitious game, and I'm not just talking about the sheer volume of boxes. It has some of the best storytelling I've seen in a game, combined with really tense and interesting boss fights. It's not a cheap game, but if you do get the opportunity to play it, it's one of those rare big Kickstarter games that does actually live up to its hype. I heard someone say recently that they've moved on from Lords of Waterdeep, and I think that does the game a disservice. It's a rock-solid worker placement game, with a theme that draws people in, despite the fact it really is just a Euro worker placement game where you are converting wooden cubes into victory points. But somehow it does it all so well. And there's nothing wrong with being an old game. In fact, the lack of bells and whistles and the comparatively simple core gameplay was like a nice warm bath after playing so many much more complex worker placement games. Scholars of the South Tigris is a masterclass in interconnecting game systems. There's really only 4 things you can do each turn, but because each action chains off everything else, there's a myriad of decisions you have to make in order to time everything right. It's a real brain burner and a head scratcher, and I think the best game to come out from that publisher in quite some time. It's definitely one of the heavier games they've made, but I feel the thematic hooks are far stronger in Scholars than some of their other titles. Scholars is probably my favourite new heavy Euro game. Suburbia is a fantastic city building game, and it's very much an engine building game for fans of engine building games, because there are a lot of calculations and math involved, and every time you place a tile, it will adjust your scores. But that constant fiddling around with the city is what really appeals to me about the game. Annoyingly, it's one game I've played less since I got the Collector's Edition. Eclipse is an epic and amazing 4X game, with some really clever features in it. It's got great exploration, fantastic shipbuilding and technology, and a really clever economy system that means you carefully have to manage your expansion. And the best thing about it is it provides this great 4X experience in an afternoon, not a whole day. Pretty as hell as well. Potion Explosion is a game where you draft marbles out of your dispenser, hoping to cause a series of chain reactions that allow you to get more marbles. And that sounds pretty simple, and fundamentally the game's not exactly complex, but it's super satisfying. It is one of those games that makes you feel clever when you play it, because you pick one marble to pull out, and that sets off a chain reaction, with its satisfying clink 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 of marbles falling down. This one is in that perfect crossover point where it's playable for families, but very serious gamers can still get a kick out of it. Civilization: A New Dawn is another game that promises to deliver a Civilization experience in about 2 hours. And it does succeed, but really only once you have the expansion for it. This is one of those games that unfortunately doesn't feel complete without the expansion, but that does elevate it into a great Civilization game. And if you've played Ark Nova, you'll recognize this core mechanic, which Ark Nova just lifted in its entirety. So if you're a fan of that system, I recommend trying out the original Civilization: A New Dawn. With the Isle of Cats, I mean, who knew that stacking cats in a boat would lead to such great gameplay? This is a fantastic tile drafting and tile placement game, and every time I play it, I really enjoy it. A huge factor of that is its emergent scoring system, that you pick up scoring cards throughout the course of the game. But ultimately, it's just very straightforward. Collect sets of cats, chuck them on a boat, have fun. The game also ships with 2 sets of rules, one designed for kids and one for more experienced gamers. And to me, that makes it an excellent idea for family game night. The older I get, the more I grow to appreciate just how brutal, wonderful, and evil a game Dune really is. And I think the recent release of a streamlined version of the game showed just how good the original game was, because that streamlined version was a really lackluster experience. Dune, on the other hand, is one of the great negotiation games. Sure, it looks like a war game, and mostly plays like a war game, but really, it is a diplomacy game. And shifting alliances and knowing the exact right time to backstab someone is absolutely game defining. And while I think Dune Imperium might be a better game, I still think Dune, the original, is the more thematic experience. This is a new edition of Libertalia, with new art that I'm not that fond of, but new mechanics that much improve the old game. The clever thing about Libertalia is everyone starts with the same cards, and each of the cards is different, and each player plays one each turn, and the game is shaped by how each player approaches the same set of cards. There's a lot of take that, a lot of second guessing what you think the other players are going to be playing that round, and overall it's a very clever game. Definitely one for people who like to put their elbows out and like a lot of take that. As far as I'm concerned, Dawn of the Zed's 3rd edition is one of the best solo gaming experiences you'll ever have. This game is brutal. It's unfair, it's unkind, and it's just downright mean, but it also creates fantastic narrative experiences. Plus, you do get better at the game, so what initially looks impossible to win, as you start to discover, explore, and finally master the game, you can even start winning on occasion. I love this game precisely because it's kicked my ass so many times. And if you're looking for a solo gaming challenge, pick it up so it can kick your ass too. Healthy Heart Hospital is another one of my favorite solo games, and this one is a bag manipulation game. Now, only a few days before I recorded this video, a new edition of this game has dropped, but I have not been able to play that one yet. So my opinion's based on the older version of the game, and I just love that experience of manipulating the bag to get the right outcomes. It's another one of those games that ends up making you feel quite clever once you crack it. Once you figure out that all the little decisions you're making each turn are to change the complexion of that bag for the final part of the turn, where you can really make some decisive moves. It is pitched as a cooperative game, but for me, this is very much a solo game. And speaking of solo games that also kick your ass, it's Robinson Crusoe! This stranded on an island game is tough. It's another game that once you feel like you've mastered it, it can still kick your ass. But when you win, it's super rewarding. Lots of cool scenarios with different rules in this one as well, and it really is a fun combination of risk management and thematic storytelling. Definitely recommend it primarily for solo though. Kolejka is a darkly comedic game about queuing for the basics in late Cold War era Poland. And that sounds like it might be a miserable experience, but this is legitimately a hilarious and fun game. And I have played it alongside someone who grew up in that era of Poland. And she explained a lot of the nuances of the game, and she thought it was hilarious. But yeah, Kolejka is all about just petty moves, and the absolute farcical nature of queuing. I think it's pretty hard to get these days, but if you can track down a copy, it is a really neat game. Empires of the Void 2 delivers an epic 4X space experience in an only 2-hour playtime. And it does this by focusing on what's important. Instead of a big fleet of ships, you have like one major ship. Instead of dozens of planets, you have a smaller number, but they're more interesting. And they each have character. And it's this focus on what matters in this genre of game, and its lack of scope creep, that make Empires of the Void 2 a very compelling experience. It's also just absolutely beautiful. Fort Circle Games have only put out 2 games, but they really impressed me. Specifically with Votes for Women. Votes for Women takes a lot of the ideas from card-driven war games and streamlines them for a general audience, without losing any of the nuance and depth that those games have. It's a real clever design, and it tells the story of the women's suffrage movement in America exceedingly well. As a game, it's great, and as a historic teaching device, it's also great. I'm really excited to see what else this company puts out. Power Grid is an area control and drafting game about building power stations in Germany. It's one of the older games on this list, but it's a game I will never turn down playing. It's a very satisfying game as you watch your energy network expand across the board. You pick up and modernize new power plants, and you use different sources of energy based on what the market is doing, and that market is determined by the other players. I think Power Grid's really clever, and it's one of those games that's probably going to be on this list forever. Space Cadets is a cooperative game where you're the bridge crew of a ship not unlike the Starship Enterprise. The quirk with this game is that every single station on the ship is a different minigame, and they're all done in real time. And this is what makes Space Cadets a fun and special game. When as a team you have a clear idea of where you want the ship to go, but after resolving all the minigames, you're pointing the wrong way, the shields are facing the wrong way, and the torpedoes aren't loaded. It's also fascinating that with practice, you can actually get really good at this game too. So it's not just slapstick hijinks and incompetence, and playing this game with a confident crew is extremely rewarding. Archaeos Society is a card drafting and set collection game where the trick to the game is once you've built a set, you have to discard all the cards in your hand. So it has this massive push your luck element to it. An exceedingly clever and fun game that's been a riot to play with every group I've played it with. Also, Archaeos Society uses a lot of mechanics from the designer's previous game, Ethnos. Horrified is a low complexity and family-friendly cooperative game that's themed around Universal Studios' depictions of classic monsters from literature. Horrified is a rock-solid cooperative game, and while it's a cliche to say, it very much is a pandemic killer. Museum is a card drafting and set collection game, and one of the most beautiful board games that's ever been made. I absolutely adore the art in this game. And that art really does add to the feeling of making a collection for a museum. There's some really clever mechanics in here. I particularly like how you can take cards from other people's discard piles, and that represents rummaging through their artworks that are not currently on display. And yeah, overall it's a very rewarding game building up these big collections. Unfortunately, this one's out of print and the company's gone under, so it might start getting pretty hard to get a hold of. Hopefully it does come back with a new owner, because it is a great game. The Captain is Dead is another one of those pandemic killers, a mid-complexity cooperative board game that's easy to teach but has some real depth. And on the higher difficulty levels, this game is really hard. In fact, it's pretty hard on even the lower difficulty levels. I dig that this game is a love letter to Star Trek, but in a way that feels earnest and not hokey and derivative. Oh look, I've been talking about Pandemic a lot, and here's my favourite Pandemic game, Pandemic the Cure. Now, why do I like Pandemic the Cure more than the original Pandemic? The dice. The crazy dice. This game has a fantastic push your luck system that allows you to re-roll the dice as many times as you want, until you get a really bad result on them. So if a roll isn't perfect, you can just re-roll it, but every time you do, there's a chance that the roll's gonna turn to custard. Each of the characters also feels really unique, and it's very fast-paced. This is a great game, as long as you don't hate dice. Speaking of games where you don't want to hate dice, here's Final Girl. It's a tricky game to describe because it's a little bit like a deck builder, but the cards only stay in your hand until they're used. And it's also a game where you live and die on the dice rolls. That said, it is much less dependent on good dice rolls than its predecessor, Hostage Negotiator. And it really does represent an evolution in design from the original Hostage Negotiator. The way it's sold is kind of confusing and weird, and it really is built around its Kickstarters, and that is a bit of a problem, but overall, as a solo game, it is a really rich thematic experience, and easily the game that best captures the atmosphere of classic horror movies. I really dig Star Trek Ascendancy. As far as big 4X space adventures go, it's the game for me, and a huge part of that is to do with its theming. The closest games to it, Twilight Imperium and Eclipse, kind of have ramshackle lore and settings that I just don't care about. Star Trek, on the other hand, is Star Trek, and it nails the theme of the factions really well. Playing the Ferengi, they're just mercenary and awful. The Klingons are super in your face, and the Vulcans are a bunch of standoffish, patronizing wankers. I really dig Star Trek Ascendancy. It has by far the best exploration of any 4X space game, and it always ramps up to a dramatic finale. No one wins in the last round because they got to go earlier in the turn order to score that last point. You normally win because you've won the decisive battles. This big chunky cooperative game is coming up on 20 years. Which is fascinating because this is the game that really made board gaming my #1 hobby. Before Arkham Horror, I would have said it was miniature wargaming or role-playing. And post Arkham Horror, it's been board gaming ever since. I can go on about this game forever, and I have at this video, Arkham Horror The Review, where I interviewed the designers of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd editions of Arkham Horror. And not only is this a great game, and a cooperative game that I still enjoy playing to this day, it's a game with a real legacy too. Le Havre is by far my favourite Uwe Rosenberg game, and that's because it is an engine builder's engine builder. Small decisions you make on the first couple of turns have huge consequences later on, and a good player of Le Havre will win by such a big margin over a poor player of the game. You can't luck your way into a good result. Blood Bowl Team Manager the card game is one of the many games that ceased to exist because of Games Workshop and Fantasy Flight Games falling out. And it might not look like much from the outside, but what a wonderful game. It does something I really like, and that is be a deck building game that allows you to do something with the deck. In this case, play sports. Pretty hard to get these days, especially some of the expansions. And I'm genuinely surprised this hasn't been rethemed somehow. Because it's absolutely the kind of game that could come back, and with a few tweaks be very successful even today. Now, my longest running board game group loves games of backstabbing and betrayal. They like being able to call each other names and generally be horrible to each other. That's what we consider a good time, and that's why we consider Spartacus, a game of blood and treachery, a really good time. Spartacus is a backstabbing and betrayal game. And as long as you have a bit of a thick skin and you enjoy that kind of table play and banter, Spartacus can be a roaring good time. There are few things more fun and rewarding in board gaming than organising a fight in the arena that is 100% rigged. Roll for the Galaxy is the second time I've put the dice version of a famous game on my top 100 instead of the original game itself. In this case, that's Race for the Galaxy. I just like how Roll for the Galaxy works. I love the multiple uses of dice, I love the different sides on all the dice, so you have different strategies and ways to win based on what you draw. It's a very clever game and it just flies by. Also, I have played the app of this entirely too much the last couple of years. While Santorini is technically 2 to 4 players, you really only play at a 2-player. But at 2-player, it is a fantastic experience. It has rules so simple you could write them on the back of a business card. But despite that, it leads to brain-burning, epic confrontations between players. Santorini is the definition of an elegant design, and the idea of a game being simple to learn but difficult to master. You move one spot, you place a block. First to place a marker on top of a stack of 3 wins the game. Sounds simple. It really isn't. So if you're looking for a 2-player game that can be played by anyone and played over and over again, Santorini is a great fit. Crisis is a worker placement game about a near-future economy that is going into recession and financial collapse. The trick with this game is you have the choice of either bolstering the economy and trying to stabilize the country, or riding it to the bottom and making as much money as you can before you cash out. Crisis also brutally punishes missteps and absolutely rewards a player who can think several turns in advance, while also having enough slack within their plan to be able to cope with changes. Honestly, this is one of the smartest worker placement games I've ever played, and it just has a certain edge that so many games are lacking in terms of its presentation, how cutthroat it is, and the commentary it has around profiteering. Highly recommend this one for serious Eurogamers. There's nothing quite like Millennium Blades, a card game about a collectible card game, where you play characters from the TV show of the collectible card game actually playing the collectible card game. And if that sounds entirely too meta, that's because it is. That said, Millennium Blades has fast-paced deck construction and card trading and collecting, and does a really good job of simulating a collectible card game tournament in only 6 card plays. A fascinating game that is truly unique. Twilight Struggle is an excellent card-driven game where you play the 2 sides in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the USA. The game's big strength is its very clever card system, where you draw from one deck of cards, and throughout the game you are forced to play cards that dramatically benefit your opponent. and how you manage those unfortunate draws is a very big part of mastering this game. Still has a few wrinkles that vaguely annoy me these days, like the Defcon system. That said, it's still one of the best head-to-head games out there. Sidereal Confluence is an absolute masterclass in game design. This is a trading game, and the premise is that you're all different members of an interstellar alliance, and every single one of you has an economy with massive strengths and massive weaknesses, and you have to trade your way to greatness. And the 9 economies are so dramatically different, and understanding how each faction works and how and when to make the best trades is the absolute key to winning this game. Its complexity can be off-putting, but once you get over that initial hurdle, there's nothing quite like a big game as Sidereal Confluence. Seven Wonders is one of those games that's not surprising it's sold so damn many copies. And that's because it's a really fast-paced game where you're making decisions all the damn time. It also scales really well from 3 to 7 players. There's lots of different approaches you can take, and each of the Wonders does feel different to play too. A perfect game for just about any gamer's collection. Circadian's First Light is a dice worker placement game from Sam McDonald, the guy who co-designed the West Kingdom and South Tigris games. And Circadians is one of my favourite games he's designed. There's some really cool features about this game. One is that the variable player powers are dialed up very high. So each time you start a game with a new leader, you're like, ooh, where can I take this power? What can I do with it? It's also a dice placing game where rolling high all the time doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna win. Chinatown is a game all about trading. You start off with randomly assigned plots of land and shop tiles, and you have to trade your way into getting contiguous tiles and sets of shops. Chinatown is all about wheeling and dealing and making trades. It's also just about to be reimagined as Waterfall Park, which appears to use the same game system, but with a very different theme. If you want a game about trading, you can't really do any better. Pan Am is a game that continues to impress me every time I play it. It's just at that crossover point in difficulty from a foundation game into a serious gamer's game, which does make it easy to teach, but it does have legitimate depth to it. And it has a somewhat unique premise. Most games like this, you'd be building a network, and the player with the biggest and baddest network at the end of the game would win, something like Power Grid. But in Pan Am, you want your network to be cannibalized. You want to make it appealing to Pan Am to buy off you. And you want to balance that between getting steady income and selling your routes to Pan Am in order to get shares. Because ultimately, the player who controls the most of Pan Am, by reinvesting the money that Pan Am gave them to buy their lines into Pan Am, is the winner, which is a fascinating win condition. Pan Am is a very clever game, and definitely one I'd recommend for people who want to take a step up in complexity from something like Catan. Everdell is a very clever worker placement and engine building game about cute critters building a woodland community. Now, I've only played this with the Pearlbrook expansion, and for me, the core game plus Pearlbrook, that's just excellent. What really kicks Everdell off though is underneath this cutesy theme, there's a serious game with tight decision making, and a really fascinating feature how you can run out of spaces in your village well before the end of the game. Whereas in most games like this, you would want to get as much as possible as soon as possible. Due to limited spacing in Everdell, you have to be a bit sharper than that. Also, if you ever see me in person, feel free to grab a copy of my card. Rush MD is a real-time game about managing a hospital, and it is absolute, total, and utter chaos. It's a sequel to Kitchen Rush, and the difficulty and complexity has been dialed up a fair bit. But this game really appeals to me just because of the sheer levels of chaos and panic while you're playing. You have to handle everything with tweezers. So if you're doing surgery, you have to pick up these organs that are not designed to be picked up with tweezers and move them onto the patients. Meanwhile, there's just a lot of chaos and table talk. And it's one of those games that if you talk clearly and you do good communication, you do so much better. And it's really rewarding to play a game of Rush MD when things start clicking. Yeah, definitely the most frenetic game I've ever played. Energy Empire is by far my favourite of the Manhattan Project trilogy of games. And there's several reasons for that, the first of which is the theming. Energy Empire is all about building up a nation's post-World War II energy infrastructure. So you're building power plants and making developments along those lines. The second part is the pacing of the game. In a normal game like this, you would place all your workers over a series of turns, then reluctantly spend a turn withdrawing them from the board. In Energy Empire, you frequently want to pull your workers off early to generate power. And that gives it a very unique cadence. And understanding that unique cadence is absolutely key to winning the game. And for me, that makes it feel unique. It's a very different game to most worker placement games. Absolutely recommend this for fans of worker placement games. Paladins of the West Kingdom is one of the heaviest games that Garphill Games has put out, but for me it's the tightest and most rewarding. Paladins is an engine building game that makes you feel smart, because it is all about chaining together moves in order to maximize the limited amount of turns and resources you have. And when you get these chains together, and when you do a big turn, you feel really smart. The skill ceiling on Paladins is super high as well, with an experienced player who knows what they're doing absolutely crushing new players. It is very thinky, and you do have to plan ahead and be able to see the patterns within the game to do well. Definitely one for the heavy Eurogamers, but if you are a heavy Eurogamer, you'll get a lot out of it. Fantastic solo mode too. In a similar way to Paladins of the West Kingdom, Underwater Cities is all about maximizing your limited actions. And if anything, Underwater Cities takes it a next step. It has a very clever system where you have to combine cards with worker actions on the board, but the strong cards match up against the weak worker actions, and vice versa. So you've got a constant balancing act between maximizing your card actions while maximizing your worker actions at exactly the same time. And those worker actions are limited spaces as well. One of the tightest and smartest Euro games I've ever played. And super rewarding to build out your underwater cities as well. Let's not underestimate the tactile nature of putting down these little domes. Definitely one for heavy Euro gamers though. With Gaia Project, we have 3 games in a row that are all very heavy Euros that are all about maximizing limited actions. Gaia Project is almost a sandbox game with the amount of decision space it has. You start off with 2 planets in a big galaxy, and there's so many paths you can take. I also love the scoring system in this game that rewards you for doing certain actions on certain turns. Because to maximize your points, you have to build your game around that, and that requires a lot of planning and deep thinking. There's also the big technology trees to explore, and a whole bunch of extremely varied player factions. Gaia Project is a super heavyweight game, and it will take you a long time to get the hang of it, but ultimately it is an incredibly rewarding experience. Again, definitely one for heavy Eurogame fans. Argent the Consortium is a worker placement game dialed up to 11. It's absolutely over the top in every single way, and I adore it for that. The premise is that there's an election at a magical college, and you are one of the professors. So it has a lot of the normal worker placement fare of placing your workers down to get associated benefits. But in Argent, each of your workers is a wizard with its own unique power, and each of the locations allows you to do strange and wonderful things. You can learn spells, you can fireball rooms, you can blow up other people's workers. Where most worker placement games are passive-aggressive and have very little conflict, Argent the Consortium is not like that. It is very in your face. It is a lot to take in as a game, and it is a bit of a pain to teach, but it's such a deep, rich, and fascinating game. About as ambitious as worker placement games get. Xiao Legends of a Drift System is a sandbox game. It's a game where you're a starship captain in a dinky little starship setting out on adventure. And you could be a courier, you could do mining, you could be smuggling, you could become a pirate. There's a whole bunch of different things you can do in Xiao. And the game really is about exploring and having fun. It's not one to be taken too seriously, and you can't play it super competitively because it is a fundamentally unfair game in parts. But that's not why it exists, and not why it's fun. It's fun because it is a sandbox game. It's fun because you get to do a whole bunch of stuff. It's fun because crazy things happen, and those make for wonderful stories. It does take quite a while to play, and it does eat a lot of table space though. Oh, and if you're a solo gamer, you absolutely have to have the expansion. Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition is a cooperative game set in the Arkham Horror universe. The key point of difference in Mansions of Madness is that it's an app-driven game, which has several advantages. It means you can do proper exploration and discovery of the scenario, and it enables the game to be fully cooperative, which the 1st edition was not. If you're on a game where you're a group of investigators looking at a haunted house and then eventually getting eaten, Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition could be for you. Yokohama is a game all about the Meiji Restoration, and that's the period of history in Japan where they went from feudal to industrial in about 2 generations. And you're playing one of these business owners, rapidly developing technology and business practices. Yokohama is a sprawling sandbox of a game, where your manager moves around the board leaving their influence behind. And the more influence you have on an area, the stronger actions you can take there. It's a very clever and different sort of game. And I also really like that it's a game about Japanese history made by a Japanese designer. And it's a great example of how different perspectives can produce very different games. So yeah, Yokohama, absolutely brilliant. I'm just dropping this note in as I do the final editing that a new version of Yokohama is coming out soon. Huzzah, because this one's been out of print. Anachrony is a beautiful and brilliant worker placement game from Mindclash Games, and it elevates itself above a normal worker placement game for several reasons. 1, it's simply gorgeous. 2, I really like that you can explore the central board using your power suits, or you can build up your own internal base and have your own worker placement actions inside your base. And I also really like the time travel system in this, where you can send resources back from your future self, but you have to pay them back or else it'll be a paradox. It's a bit of a head burner, but it's a nice way to abstractly show how time travel would work in a board game. Yeah, neat worker placement game. The only problem with it now is it's such a big game to set up that it doesn't see the table quite as much as it probably should. While this entry is for the crew Mission Deep Sea, the original crew is almost as good. And what these games are is they are trick-taking games, but they're cooperative trick-taking games. So if you've played Whist, Bridge, 500 or any of those sort of games, you'll understand the fundamentals of the crew. The trick here is that you're trying to win specific tricks, and you're trying to win them as a team. And as a concept that's so simple, it's just brilliant. And you can easily play 5, 10, 15 games with the crew in an evening. And the reason I prefer Mission Deep Sea is that the games are a little bit more varied with their rules. Absolutely my favourite cooperative game with an under 10-minute playtime. Unsettled is a cooperative space exploration game where instead of being the best and brightest humanity has to offer, you're a bunch of idiots who like to poke things with sticks and see what happens. Unsettled is possibly the best written game I've ever played. The dialogue, the narrative stuff in this, it's all hilarious. It's sold in an unusual way. We have a core box and then each planet is its own expansion. But each of the planets is really varied and different, and each planet has multiple scenarios within it. And I found the whole experience of playing Unsettled really fun and rewarding. You just have to laugh at the crazy stuff you and your crew get up to. I highly recommend this for a group that likes cooperative games and plays together a lot, because you'll create a whole bunch of memeable moments. Paths of Glory is my favourite card-driven war game and my favourite game about the First World War. It does a great job of letting you play out the First World War while not keeping you on rails too much. It's also the only game about the First World War I've played that really models that you have to attack on the Western Front, without making that an absolute mandatory thing you have to do. You have to make bad attacks. You have to throw your troops into situations where they're probably going to lose terribly. And I think it's brilliant that a war game has that in it. This is definitely not a theme for everyone, but if you are interested in the First World War, and the idea of playing a game that's fought across like a dozen fronts sounds interesting to you, definitely check out Paths of Glory. It's magnificent. War of the Ring is a card-driven war game about the Lord of the Rings. And in this game, the Free People and the Shadow players face off against each other in a very asymmetric game. And there's two main things happening. There's a war game here, where the Shadow player has far stronger and far tougher forces, and given time will eventually overwhelm the Free People's player. But the Free People's player has the ring, and they're trying to sneak that into Mount Doom and win that way. And it's these two competing concepts of victory that make War of the Ring really, really smart. Because the player who wins is the player who balances those best, who defends on one of those goals while attacking on the other to the best of their ability. Also, War of the Ring just has a knack of telling great stories. Azul is my favourite abstract game, and still my favourite game of the Azul series by some distance. And that's because of its beautiful simplicity. The way you draft tiles and place them on the board to score points. Every game I play, I still forget how tight the board is going to get at the end of the game. And unlike some similar games, there's plenty of space to be nasty in this when it comes to drafting. Because in Azul, if you're forced to eat a bunch of tiles you don't want, it's quite catastrophic to your score. That said, Summer Pavilion and Queen's Garden are both excellent games, but nothing has come close to beating the original. Leaving Earth is all about the space race, and it's all about risk, and it's all about math. And one would think a game that's this mathy and this complex would be utterly dull, but my goodness is Leaving Earth captivating. And it's to do with the risk system. You see, every time you test a component, there's a chance it will fail. If you turn over a failure, terrible things happen, but failures are easy to progress from. If you test something and it's successful all the time, that actually costs you more money. So there's a push your luck element in here. Do I put things into space without properly testing them, or do I spend a lot of money to thoroughly test them so I know every system works 100%? And that ties into the race element of the game, because you can see someone testing away their things and go, ooh, maybe if I launch this rocket untested, I can beat them to the moon. Wonderfully deep and rich game. You do have to be a friend of math to enjoy this, but if it gets its hooks into you, there's nothing quite like a game of Leaving Earth. Well, a dexterity game in my top 20. There goes my hardcore gamer cred. That said, Junkard is just neat. There's something magical about placing these irregular shapes and stacking them up high. Logically, you always think the tower is going to collapse way before it does. There's 10 different game modes in this, and you can play a World Series where you play through all the game modes. We tend to play 3 to 5 game modes in a session, and each of these game modes does treat the pieces and makes you do different things, but it's all about the stacking. This game is just fun, and absolutely one I'd recommend for anyone who isn't a humorless jerk. Block by Block Uprising is the third version of Block by Block to come out, and I've enjoyed all three of them, but Uprising is by far the most balanced of the three. And as always, I love the overall feel of this game. It's a cooperative game in the style of Pandemic, but it feels when you're playing it more like a tight little war game, where the police are marching through the city and you're trying to block them off and contain them and eventually take over ground. I also love how unapologetically political this game is. It has a message and it's not afraid to set fire to your house to get that message across. Really compelling gameplay though as well. The more I play Tyrants of the Underdark, the more I enjoy it. And that's for many of the same reasons that Dune Imperium got on the list this year. And that is because it's a deck building game where you get to do something with your deck. And in Tyrants of the Underdark, that means conquering the Underdark. It's been an absolute hit with every group I've played it with, and one of those games that keeps getting asked to be put back on the table. It also has one of the most exciting end games of any game I've played, because space starts to run out, the decks you've built start getting more and more powerful, and those last couple of turns are really intense. So many games finish with a whimper, this one always finishes with a bang. Battlestar Galactica is an oldie but a goodie, and it's my main gaming group's signature game. We've played this a lot. We haven't played it that much recently though, which is one reason why it's probably fallen here. But when we do, the stories this game will tell. Battlestar Galactica is all about social deduction. It's all about lying to your friends and trying to blow them up. And with the right group, which I have, it is absolutely sublime experience. The game itself is out of print, but Unfathomable, which is a Cthulhu reskin, also exists. I just have the original, so I don't really think about Unfathomable very much. This War of Mine was the very first game I backed on Kickstarter, and I'm really pleased that I did, as it's one of my favourite narrative experiences in a board game ever. Now, it's a little bit sprawling and a little bit overcooked, but it does have a knack of telling really powerful and interesting stories. They're not necessarily the most cheerful stories you'll ever find in a game, but they are interesting and emotional. I think this War of Mine is best at either solo playing or with two players. That way the game still feels quite intimate. I think it would be a terrible game to play by committee. And when I have played it with groups, we've always come away with a shared experience. A shared story we can tell about what happened in the game. It's a very thoughtful and thought-provoking experience, even if the mechanics are a little clunky in places. It's definitely not a game for everyone because some of the stuff that happens is pretty rough. Terraforming Mars is an exceptional engine building game about terraforming the planet Mars. And it is one of my most played games. I've put up 1,000 hours on the app for this. The reason it's fallen down a little bit for me though is scope creep. Terraforming Mars is at its best when you're terraforming Mars. And there's now so many expansions and bloat for the game that I feel like to get the best out of it, I've had to curate it down to a slimmer, meaner experience. Because it is a rock solid engine building game. And nothing yet has quite captured the variety of cards and the variety of engines you can build in Terraforming Mars. So yeah, an excellent game, but suffering from a bit of scope creep, which is why it is no longer my favourite engine building game. That game is up next. And at number 10 we have my current favourite engine building game, It's a Wonderful World. What sets It's a Wonderful World apart from most other engine building games is its pacing. This game is blindingly fast. It only goes through 4 full rounds, and each round is drafting 7 cards, so you're looking at a total of 28 card plays. And it's the way that the resolution in this game works, so grey cards resolve, that give you resources that you can use to spend on black cards, which give you resources you can spend on green cards, all the way through to the end. So you end up with 5 different resolution phases each round. But it's that chaining of resources and maximizing how the timing works in this game that makes a huge difference between a good score and an awesome score. So it's easy enough to play a 3 or 4 player game of It's a Wonderful World in about 40 minutes. And the entire time is crammed with decisions from start to finish. And I can't say that about other engine building games, that they're quite as intense all the way through. Some games like Terraforming Mars are a bit more of a slow burn. And it's the intensity of It's a Wonderful World that has really elevated it for me. And also the shorter playtime. I can bring this out at the end of a session if we've finished early. Say we've got a 3-hour block, we've played a 2-hour game, we've got an hour left. Great. Let's pack up that other game, play It's a Wonderful World, and we'll still be heading off early. I never have any regrets when I do that in an evening. So yeah, this one is my favourite engine building game, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's into engine building. If you've played games like Terraforming Mars or Ark Nova, and you want something faster, tighter, and more intense, It's a Wonderful World. Number 9 is probably the most enjoyable game I play, and that is Roll Camera. Roll Camera is a game about making films, but it's a game about the silly side of making films, and each of you is playing a different creative force behind whatever masterpiece you're trying to pull together. Now, throughout the game, you'll be assigning dice to different sections of the board in order to do the different tasks associated with making a film. But what really makes it stand out is just how damn silly it is. So the core gameplay, it's rock solid cooperative board game sort of stuff. Place dice on locations to take actions, deal with upcoming threats, and generally try to do your best to allocate the limited resources you have. And there are two things that really elevate this game for me and take it from just a garden variety co-op into something really, really fun. And the first are the team meetings that you have. So in these meetings, you get to pitch ideas from the idea deck. So you'll have a hand of idea cards and you'll get to put forward your suggestions. And the suggestions are universally terrible. They're things like replacing all of your extras with cardboard cutouts just to save money. And if you get into it and you make a compelling case for why that will make the film better, it changes the game from just a regular co-op into a really fun social experience. And the other one are the privileges in the game. So each of your character cards has a different privilege, and you can optionally play with these in effect. But I have no idea why you wouldn't. Unless you're a completely joyless and humorless human being. Like, here's a couple of them. The editor, you may require other players to start or stop speaking or moving at your command. And on the other side, it says you may make other players speak slower, faster, backwards, or in foreign accents. So it's reasonably tricky to articulate, but what ends up happening is you have this hubbub of noise and banter and silliness around, what is a pretty normal sort of cooperative game aside from these points of difference. But just flat out, it has been the game that has been the most fun for me and my groups to play over the last year or so. It's a game that when I put it on the table, everyone's eyes light up. There's big smiles and everyone knows they're going to have a good time. And what more do you want from board gaming? Roll Camera, a game about making movies that's really good for established groups. Lots and lots of fun. And also it has this box. At number 8 we have Nemesis, my favourite Alien game that they can't call an Alien game. And there is a lot to love about Nemesis. As I've said before in this video, my group likes games with backstabbing and betrayal. That's my main group of friends. Nemesis is full of backstabbing and betrayal. But what sets it apart from me are two things. The first is that the betrayal aspect of this game is opt-in. You can entirely play Nemesis cooperative, and it's a great game cooperative. It's still a very enjoyable experience. But you can also play it with secret goals where they're non-antagonistic secret goals. So you don't necessarily have to be backstabbing and betraying the whole time. It's opt-in betrayal. You decide if you want to be the kind of person that stabs your friend in the back or not. The game doesn't force you to do that. And I think that's really clever distinction. Because I think Nemesis shines when it's played most like a cooperative game with a little bit of betrayal and backstabbing in it. If everyone starts off from the get-go being terrified of each other and running around and generally acting like the betrayal's already happened, the game kind of falls off the rails. And it's been fascinating for me to play with groups that do that, where they're like, oh no, I'm going to run off here, and then basically everyone dies then. When the game's at its best is when it's played mostly cooperatively, and then the betrayal comes late. The backstab is like, someone fakes out, they're like, oh yeah, no, I really need to get these eggs. That's my goal, it's to get the eggs. When really their goal is to get player 2 into a room that they can then close the door on and have them get feasted on. And that makes the game for me. It's also a beautiful game, and the game I would most like to finish painting. The fact is, with a toddler, I do not get enough painting time. And if you're wondering about Nemesis Lockdown, as far as I'm concerned with the two games, I'm counting them as one entry. So Nemesis and Nemesis Lockdown sit here. There is a few distinctions between the game, but it's not enough. It's not enough for me to consider them separate entries. And that's why I've got the Nemesis figures here and the Nemesis Lockdown figures here. And I really do need to paint all the heroes and all of the other expansion content as well. And then there's a new one coming out. But I think that one does look significantly different. I don't think that's going to come under the same sort of entry, because it looks like it's a very different game and at a very different scale. So we'll see how that one turns out. But hopes aren't that high, to be honest. So yeah, who do I recommend Nemesis to? I recommend Nemesis to people who like painting miniatures, for starters. I think the game looks a lot better if it's painted. I also recommend it to groups that have robust social interactions. So for casual groups, this one isn't particularly friendly, but if you've got a group that can handle a little bit of banter and a little bit of interaction and a little bit of backstabbing and betrayal, you could have a lot of fun with Nemesis. And also, I recommend it to fans of the Alien franchise because, let's be honest, it's an Alien game. It's not even subtle. But it's a great Alien game, and that's why it's number 8 on my top 100 games. Number 7 is Obsession, the Euro game about hosting parties and winning favour in Victorian England. And if you want to know everything there is to know about this game, check out Steph's deep dive video on it. Obsession is Steph's favourite game of all time, and she goes into it in great detail there. But from my point of view, I'm going to say that it is a super tight game. It's one of those games where every single decision matters, and that's what really appeals to me. The theme integration's really neat as well. Like, Victorian England households aren't really my jam, but it's done so well here that you can't help but get sucked into it. And to me, that's a big part of a great game, is when the theme is so connected to the mechanics that you just get drawn into the experience. You get drawn into running a household, you get drawn into having these parties and inviting people over and going, "Oh, how gosh," and such things while you're playing. And if it was just the excellent theming, I'm not sure that would hold my attention for too long. What keeps me coming back is that the mechanics of the game are rock solid. It's a very, very tight game. Every decision matters. So while you're laughing and making silly voices, you're also still playing a game that has very high demands of you as a player. This is Can2 Games' only game at the moment, and I'm really excited to see what they do next, because this is a hell of a first entry into the board gaming market. Number 6 is one of my all-time favourite cooperative games, Thunderbirds. Now, this is designed by Matt Leacock, the guy who does all the Pandemic games and the Forbidden Island series, but for me, this is his masterclass. The sad thing is, Thunderbirds was not a hit. It was a limited release game to start with, and it was an IP that really only had fandom in the United Kingdom and probably Australia, New Zealand, and maybe a few other places. It wasn't a big hit in the US market, let's just say that. And what that meant is the game flew under a lot of radars because, you know, the IP just wasn't something that appealed to people. But when people have played this game, when it's finally hit their table, they've gone, wow, this is the best Pandemic game by far. And I'm one of those people, like, when I got a hold of it, I was like, man, this is so good. Thunderbirds revolves around pickup and delivery. So the idea is that there are these disasters happening on the board, and you've got to pick up your crew and the right equipment and deliver them to the right place at the right time. So instead of just moving around the board and removing diseases, you're having to logistically move around and time things well. It's got an extra layer, an extra depth there, that its initial theme might not suggest that it was that deep. Because you look at it and you go, oh, that looks like a silly puppet show from the 60s. How good a game could it possibly be? And I'm telling you now, it's a really good game. I'd really love to see this game come back. I don't think it ever will, which is kind of stink. Because I'm not sure you could re-theme it in a way that would work. Because it's the integration of the theme to Thunderbirds and International Search and Rescue. It's so well done here. For me, it's not only the definitive Thunderbirds game, it's a definitive mid-weight cooperative game as well. Anyway, if you can track down a copy of this, I do recommend it for pretty general audiences. I think it's simple enough that you could play it with family as long as there was some coaching and guidance there as well. And I think even the most serious gamers can look at this and get something out of it, especially on the higher difficulties, because it is a great puzzle to solve. And I think the peak of the design concept that started off with Pandemic. Number 5 is Star Wars Rebellion, a card-driven war game about the galactic civil war in the Star Wars universe. Now, if you've been watching the whole video, you saw that War of the Ring is in my top 20, and a lot of what I have to say about Rebellion is the same as War of the Ring. They're great thematic war games that take an established IP and let you play it out in your own way. They're both card-driven and character-focused, and they both have asymmetric win conditions. But I think overall, Rebellion is a more rewarding experience to me. The hunt for the ring in War of the Ring is great and all, but the hunt for the hidden rebel base is even better. And because of some of the card plays, there's a lot more dramatic reversals and ability to move troops around the board faster in Rebellion, and that makes for a more dynamic experience to me. Plus, it is so very character focused, so it just creates these amazing narratives each time you play it, based on what characters you recruit and at what time and what missions they're sent on. If you like two-player games, and you like competitive games, and you've got to spare 3 to 4 hours to play it, especially the first couple of games while you're learning it, you can do so much worse than Star Wars Rebellion. Even if you're not a big Star Wars fan, I think the game here is good enough to be played just as a two-player competitive game. The theming, of course, elevates it, and I am a big Star Wars fan, And it really does connect with me in that regard. But ultimately, what makes the game is it's so damn tight. Every game I've played of this has been really close and really exciting all the way through. A great cat and mouse game between the Empire and Rebel players. Oh, and it's another game that I am very pleased that I have fully painted. Number 4 on my list is Brass Birmingham. Currently Board Game Geek's #1 game, and that's well deserved in my mind. Like, I've put 3 other games ahead of it, but they're not ahead of it by a mile. Brass is a masterclass. And the reason for that is twofold. First, you get dealt a set of 8 cards at the start of the game, and each time you play one, you have diminishing options based on what you have left. So you start off with a world of options and things you can do on the board, but those get diminished as your hand reduces through play. And I really like the tightening of the decision space in the game. The other thing I like is there's only 2 full rounds like this. So you go through 8 cards and you do that twice, and then the game's over. So there's 16 effective decisions you're making. So the game's super, super tight, and every action is important. And I also love how interactive the game is. A lot of what you're doing, you'll require coal or iron. And a big way to get points in this game is doing what's called flipping your buildings. So that's when, say, your iron mine runs out of iron. Effectively, it is used up its reserve and it flips over. And you want your buildings to flip over because it'll give you more income and more points. And the thing is, other players can utilize those resources. So you see someone's got some goods down and they want to ship some stuff, so you build a brewery next to them because they need the beer to ship things. You've helped them out, but they've also helped you out. And the game is all about these really strong, positive interactions. You want to be absolutely interconnected with the other players, and also making maximum benefit when opportunities arise, based on the current board position. From the outside, Brass looks like it could be just another boring cube-pushing Euro. It is not. It is a highly interactive, highly competitive, and highly cerebral experience. And I recommend this to any serious gaming group. Even if you're normally not into Euro games and you like your dice chuckers and stuff, still recommend giving Brass a go because it has that level of interactivity that normally isn't in Euro games. And for me, interactivity is a huge part of board gaming and why I play board games. And Brass absolutely shines in that respect. At number 3, we have the last 4 years in a row my #1 game, Spirit Island. Now, why has it fallen from number 1 to number 3? Is that a great plummet? No, this is still one of my absolute favorite games. I'm just having a bit more trouble bringing it to the table. And in the last year or so, other games have captured my imagination more. Now, what is Spirit Island? Spirit Island is a heavyweight cooperative game where you are playing guardian spirits of an island that is being colonized. And each of the spirits is incredibly asymmetric. They all have really unique powers and ways of impacting the board. Plus, your spirit develops over the course of the game, gaining new powers. So there's an emergent playstyle there as well. So it has amazing cooperative play, and it has this amazing ability to explore and discover new playstyles within the different spirits. It's a game where you can discover and learn so much more each and every time you play it, because there's different combinations of spirits, there's different adversaries, there's different scenarios, and there's different ways to build each spirit as you level up. And all of that hangs on top of an incredibly robust and strong core gameplay engine. And there's also just the theming. I just adore the theming of this game. Its anti-colonial nature. The spirits really resonate with me as well because I grew up in the Waikato in Aotearoa, and in case you don't know, that river has a guardian spirit at every single bend of the river. So yeah, Spirit Island has a bit of a personal connection to me, and it will always likely be one of my all-time favorite games. But this year, 2 games have just gotten to my head a lot more than Spirit Island has. The number 2 game on my list is The Castles of Burgundy. And this one has been steadily growing in my favour since I first played it about 3 years ago. I dug the core game so much that I ended up backing this monstrosity. And unlike, say, the Suburbia box set, I'm actually really enjoying this one. It's nice and easy to use, and actually has some gameplay improvements, like making the tiles a lot easier to read. So when you're not sure what something does, you can just pick it up, turn it around and go, oh, that's what that building does. I really, really like that. But what makes Castles so damn good is rolling 2 dice and then taking the 2 actions. Like, you have this limited decision space in front of you. So every turn you've just got this focus on these 2 dice rolls and what you do with them. But the possibilities of what you can do with them end up being very wide, so the game evolves as you're playing it. And I find that really rewarding, just how simple the core system there is. Roll 2 dice and assign them. And how big the decision space from that becomes. And it's staggeringly good design. It's also a game that I play with my group of friends who aren't into Euro games. And they like Castles of Burgundy. They also like Brass Birmingham, but they like Castles, even though Castles isn't a hugely interactive game. Because it is so laser focused. Because it does make you feel clever for stringing together combos. And because it is just a rock solid game with very few flaws. This is a game I'd recommend to a lot of groups. I don't necessarily recommend you get this special edition unless you know you absolutely love the game. These kind of things really are for super fans of a game. Don't buy this unless, like, as your first step into a game. Buy the core box or rent the core box or do something with the core box other than spending all the money on this, because this is excessive if you're not going to be playing the game over and over and over again. And Castles is not leaving my collection anytime soon. And it's one of the games I have played the most this last year. And considering the amount of time I spent playing games for review, finding space to play a game like a dozen times on top of those review games, that says something about it. And Castles is a game that I've found the time to do that. And if you've been paying attention to the channel this year, the new #1 game will hardly surprise you. It's Arkham Horror the card game. You might notice the table looks a bit different, and that's because I've had the topper on. Because the last wee while, Arkham Horror has been living inside the table. See, we're currently running a Scarlet Keys campaign, and we've just kicked that off, and the game lives inside the table between sessions. That's how much I've been focused on the game and how into it I've been. It is the default game that lives inside my table. I don't put it away when we're done, I just leave it here, then I cover it up and I play other games on top. Because if I want to play Arkham, I want to play Arkham straight away. That's how much I've been focused on it. And why is that? Well, it's several reasons. First, it is a fantastic cooperative game. And playing with a group of friends is as close to a role-playing game as you'll get inside a board game. It's also a phenomenal solo game as well, and I do like to play solo games two-handed. It has the strongest narrative of any board game I've ever played, plus it also has deck construction rules. And I used to play Android Netrunner, the Star Wars LCG, Magic the Gathering, and a Jihad, and a bunch of other collectible card games. And I really like that aspect of building decks for games, you know, experimenting, what can I do, how can I make this deck work, and having that kind of discovery and fun in a game. And Arkham Horror allows me to do that. It combines so many things I like in games. It's in the Lovecraft mythos, which is something I enjoy in games. It has really strong narrative, something I'm big on. It has strong mechanical and narrative consistency, which is a really huge selling point for me. It's cooperative, and I really like cooperative games, and it has that deck construction element. This is a game that intellectually stimulates me on a whole bunch of different levels. It's a game that I think about when I'm not playing. I'll be sitting there with my phone, like, bringing up cards and creating lists and stuff. It's just a game that's got under my skin, and it's almost entirely because of the new packaging for it. So I was quite into Arkham when it first came out, but they sold it in these little boxes, and you had to get like 7 of them to complete a story arc. And in New Zealand, that was just a giant pain in the butt. It was just virtually impossible to keep on top of that, especially as we were having a little bit of financial trouble at the time as well. So, you know, spending $30 or whatever to track down a pack and then maybe having to import one because you missed one, it was a burden. But now, because they've repackaged the game into these big boxes where you only need to get 2 things to get a whole campaign. You get all of the campaign in one big box like this, and then a smaller box for all the investigator cards. It's just made it so much more accessible for me. And yeah, I am really enjoying it. We are playing the Scarlet Keys. We just finished the Path to Carcosa. I did a big video on that. I spoke for 33 minutes on just one campaign of Arkham Horror. And I like to keep things concise. So the fact that I could bloviate and windbag along for over 30 minutes about one campaign for one game says an awful lot about just how into this game I am and how much fun I'm having with it and how much fun potentially you could have with it if it's the sort of thing that appeals to you. So yeah, if you like cooperative games, if you like storytelling, if you like the Lovecraft universe, although that's not necessarily a must, I don't think, because the core mechanics and the core gameplay are so strong. And if you like building decks for games, then yeah, Arkham Horror the card game absolutely should be for you. It's 100% for me, and it is my #1 game of 2023. So you made it to the end of the video. Fantastic. So yeah, as mentioned before, this is my top 100 games of all time. This is not necessarily the definitive top 100 games of all time. If there's a game that isn't on this list that you think I would enjoy based on what I've said on games here, make a suggestion in the comments. I'll see if I get to it. That's how I got into Castles of Burgundy. It was originally suggested to me by some comments, so I tracked it down and I gave it a play and I really enjoyed it. And there's been plenty of other games I've discovered that way as well. And a reminder that we are an independent, free-to-air channel. We do not do paid content, we do not get money from publishers. And if you'd like to support us, you can always do that on Patreon or Ko-Fi. And until next time, take care all.